Welcome to Stories with Grandma Celine, where timeless African wisdom comes alive. Sit close, open your heart, and journey into tales filled with lessons, adventure, proverbs, and mystery. Every story carries the voice of our ancestors, guiding, teaching, and inspiring. Subscribe and turn on your notification bell so you never miss a story, as Grandma Celine shares a fresh tale every day. Let's keep the wisdom of our heritage alive, one story at a time. Stanley had the world at his feet. Gold on his wrists, a fleet of cars in his driveway, and a heart that had turned into a cold, hard stone. He thought he could buy respect, and more importantly, he thought he could buy revenge. When he sent that invitation to Victoria, his poor ex-girlfriend, he expected to see her cower. He expected his rich friends to laugh at her tattered shoes. But when the doors swung open, the laughter died in their throats, the music stopped. The wine glasses stayed frozen mid-air. Stanley's world didn't just shake, it shattered. Because Victoria wasn't who he thought she was, and the secret she carried was about to cost him everything. Stanley lived by a single proverb: when the moon is shining, the cripple becomes hungry for a walk. For Stanley, the moon was always shining on his bank account. 10 years ago, he was a boy with one shirt and a dream. Today, he was the man the city whispered about. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, looking down at the city lights. He felt like a god. His upcoming 35th birthday wasn't just a celebration, it was a coronation. He had invited governors, oil magnates, and celebrities, but his guest list had one name that didn't belong: Victoria. He remembered her clearly, the girl who shared her meager lunch with him when he had nothing. The girl who stayed behind in the dusty village while he ran to the city to find his fortune. He hadn't spoken to her in 5 years, not since he sent her a cold letter telling her she was no longer a fit for his new life. "I want her to see," Stanley muttered, swirling his expensive cognac. "I want her to smell the perfume of success and realize she is nothing but a footnote in my story." He took a golden pen and handwrote the invitation. He made sure to add a postscript: "Dress your best, Victoria. I wouldn't want you to feel out of place." He chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on a grave. He didn't see the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. The village of Humiliate was quiet, save for the rhythmic thumping of pestles against mortars. Victoria sat in front of her modest hut, sorting dried herbs. Her hands were calloused, and her face bore the gentle lines of a woman who had seen many seasons of toil. When the shiny black car drove into the village, chickens scattered in a frenzy of feathers. A driver in a crisp uniform stepped out, looking at the red earth with disdain. He handed Victoria a thick, cream-colored envelope. "From Mr. Stanley," the driver said curtly. Victoria opened it. The paper felt like silk. As she read the words, her heart performed a slow, painful ache. She saw the postscript, the jagged edge of Stanley's arrogance. She looked at her reflection in a basin of water nearby. She saw a woman who worked the land, a woman who had stayed behind to care for the elders while Stanley chased shadows. "He wants to show me his gold," she whispered to herself. "And why shouldn't you go?" a voice rasped. It was Mama Enkech, the oldest woman in the village, leaning on her offer staff. "The eagle does not fly because it wants to show off its wings, it flies because the sky belongs to it. Go, Victoria, but do not go as a beggar, go as the daughter of the soil." For 3 days, Victoria did not emerge from her hut. The villagers wondered if she was grieving the past. In reality, she was kneeling before an old wooden chest that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman the village once called the Queen of the Loom. Inside the chest was a bundle wrapped in aged banana leaves. This wasn't ordinary fabric. It was aqueous cloth, but not the kind sold in the markets. This was woven with silver thread grass, a plant that only grew near the sacred springs and dyed with the indigo of the deep forest. As Victoria shook out the garment, a faint, earthy fragrance filled the room, the smell of rain on dry earth and crushed jasmine. Her grandmother had told her, "One day the world will try to make you feel small. On that day, wear your heritage." Victoria spent the night sewing, her needle moving with a grace that felt guided by invisible hands. She wasn't just making a dress, she was stitching together her dignity. She thought of Stanley. She remembered the boy who used to cry because he was hungry, the boy she had protected. A tear fell onto the fabric, but instead of staining it, the liquid seemed to be absorbed, making the silver threads glow brighter. She was ready. The ballroom of the Grand Horizon Hotel was a sea of white and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the ceiling. Stanley stood at the center of a circle of businessmen, his chest puffed out like a mating pigeon. "The secret to wealth," Stanley was saying, "is knowing what to discard. You cannot carry the weight of the past if you want to climb the mountain of the future." His friends laughed, clutching their champagne. They knew who he was talking about. Stanley had spent the last hour subtly warning them about a guest from his past, a charity case he had invited out of the goodness of his heart. She might smell of wood smoke, he joked, so keep your expensive cigars ready to mask the scent. The clock struck 9. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall began to turn. Stanley straightened his silk tie, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. He signaled to the band to play something jaunty, something that would make a village girl feel clumsy and out of step. He wanted everyone to turn and see the peasant enter his palace. He wanted the contrast to be so sharp it would cut her. The doors opened. The smirk on Stanley's face didn't just fade, it vanished. The music didn't just stop. The violinist's bow slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. Victoria walked in. She didn't look like a woman who had spent years in a village. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of a leopardess. Her dress was a masterpiece of deep indigo and shimmering silver, catching the light in a way that made the diamonds on the other women look like cheap glass. Around her neck was a simple piece of polished jasper, hanging from a leather cord. But it wasn't just the dress. It was the way she held her head. Her eyes weren't filled with the awe of a poor girl seeing luxury. They were filled with the calm, terrifying depth of an ocean that knew exactly how many ships it had swallowed. The Chief Justice, an old man who rarely spoke to anyone, stood up. His hands were trembling. "That pattern," he whispered, his voice carrying in the unnatural silence. "Only the royal house of the Lost Kingdom wears the silver thread. Where did a girl like this find such a thing?" Stanley's heart hammered against his ribs. This wasn't the humiliation he had planned. This was something else. This was a haunting. Stanley's face burned. The silence was not the mocking kind he had rehearsed in his mind. It was a silence of profound reverence. He stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the marble, a sound that felt strangely desperate. "Victoria," he said, his voice cracking slightly. You managed to find something to wear. I suppose the village pooled their resources for this one night." He laughed, hoping his friends would join in, but the laughter was thin and died quickly. Victoria didn't flinch. She looked at him, not with anger, but with a pity that strung worse than any insult. "I didn't need to pool resources, Stanley," she replied, her voice calm and resonant. "I only needed to go to the chest you told me to burn 10 years ago, the one you called peasant junk." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Among the guests was Chief Olowo, the most powerful land developer in the country. He pushed past Stanley, his eyes fixed on Victoria's necklace. "Young lady," Olowo said, ignoring Stanley completely. "That jasper stone, it bears the seal of the Ahmadi estate, the estate that holds the deed to the entire northern corridor. I have been looking for the heir to that land for 20 years. My lawyers said the lineage had vanished into the tall grass of the village." Stanley's drink nearly slipped from his hand. The northern corridor was the very land he had been trying to buy for his next multi-billion-dollar project. He had been told the land was deadlocked in an ancient family trust. "There must be a mistake," Stanley stammered, stepping between Victoria and Chief Olowo. "She's a farmer's daughter. Her father was a simple man who died with nothing but a hoe in his hand." Victoria stepped closer to Stanley. So close he could smell the jasmine and rain on her skin. "My father died with his dignity, Stanley, something you traded for a gold watch. He didn't die with nothing. He died leaving me the guardianship of the soil you are currently standing on." The room felt smaller. The glamorous guests, who moments ago were snickering at Stanley's jokes, were now leaning in, their faces pale. "What are you talking about?" Stanley hissed. "The Grand Horizon Hotel," Victoria said, looking around the lavish ballroom. "Built on the old Ahmadi family grounds. You leased this land through a holding company, didn't you, Stanley? You thought the owner was a ghost. You thought as long as you paid the taxes to the local council, no one would ever come to claim the roots." She reached into a small, beaded purse and pulled out a weathered, laminated document. It was a primary deed, dated 50 years ago, signed with the thumbprint of a man Stanley remembered, Victoria's grandfather. Stanley felt the floor tilt. He had spent millions developing this hotel. It was his crown jewel, the source of his status. If the land deed was contested, especially by someone with the ancestral claim Victoria held, his investors would flee before the sun rose. "You're lying," Stanley whispered, though his sweat told a different story. "This is a stunt. You're trying to humiliate me because I left you." "I didn't come to humiliate you, Stanley," Victoria said softly. "You did that to yourself the moment you sent an invitation intended to wound. I came because the land cried out. It doesn't recognize the vibration of your greed. One of Stanley's biggest investors, a woman named Elena, stepped forward. She was known for her coldness, but now her eyes were sharp with calculation. Stanley, you told us you own the title outright. If there is a cloud on this deed, our merger is dead. I don't move money into sinking sand. It's not sinking, Stanley shouted, his composure finally snapping. She's a nobody, look at her, she's playing a part. He reached out to grab Victoria's arm to pull her toward the door, but a hand stayed his wrist. It was Chief Olowo. The old man's grip was like iron. In our land, Chief Olowo said, his voice dropping an octave, we have a saying. The man who builds his house with stolen straw should not pray for a dry season. Stanley, you have been very loud tonight, but the blood in this girl's veins is older than your bank account. Olowo turned to Victoria and bowed his head slightly, a gesture that sent a shockwave through the room. A billionaire bowing to a village girl. The Amadi family saved my father's life during the Great Famine, Olowo told the crowd. They were the keepers of the grain, they never boasted, they never wore their wealth on their sleeves, they wore it in their hands, which were always open to the poor. The guests began to turn away from Stanley, literally shifting their bodies toward Victoria. The gravity of the room had changed. Stanley was no longer the host, he was a ghost in his own house. Victoria looked at the table of expensive gifts Stanley had received. She walked over and picked up a small, hand-carved wooden bird, the only humble gift there, sent by a local craftsman. You used to carve these for me, Stanley. When you had nothing, you gave everything. Now that you have everything, you give nothing but pain. As the night progressed, the party Stanley had meticulously planned became his trial. He tried to restart the music, but the band members were whispering among themselves. He tried to offer a toast, but no one raised their glass. He retreated to the bar, gulping down whiskey. From the corner of his eye, he saw Victoria surrounded by the city's elite. They weren't asking her about the village. They were asking for her blessing, for her stories, for a chance to discuss the Northern Corridor project. She's stealing it, Stanley muttered to the bartender who ignored him. She's stealing my life. No, a voice said behind him. It was his mother. She had arrived late, dressed in her simple Sunday best, looking out of place in the gold-trimmed room. She had been watching from the shadows. She isn't stealing anything, Stanley. She's just reclaiming what you threw away. Not you too, Ma, Stanley groaned. I told you, my son, his mother said, her eyes sad. A tree with shallow roots can only grow so high before the wind finds it. You cut your roots when you left her. You cut them when you started lying about where you came from. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the hall. People screamed. A large, decorative marble slab on the wall, the one bearing Stanley's company logo, had shifted, a long fissure running right through his name. The crack in the marble was more than just a structural failure. It was a physical manifestation of Stanley's crumbling world. The guests backed away from the wall, their murmurs turning into frantic whispers. In the high society circles of the city, omens were taken seriously, and the sight of Stanley's name split in two by a jagged fissure felt like a divine verdict. Stanley stood frozen, his glass trembling. It's just the building settling, he shouted, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked at the maintenance staff, gesturing wildly for them to cover it up, but they stood still, their eyes fixed on Victoria. Victoria walked toward the center of the room. She didn't look at the cracked marble. She looked at the people, the men in their three-piece suits and the women draped in diamonds. The earth remembers what the heart tries to forget, she said softly, yet her voice carried to every corner of the silent hall. You invited me here to see your height, she continued, turning to Stanley. But you forgot that the higher a building stands, the more it relies on the ground beneath it. You called this land yours, but you never asked the land for permission to build. Stanley's lead architect, a man who had been sipping champagne by the fountain, stepped forward, his brow furrowed. Mr. Stanley, we had issues with the foundation during the build. You told us to bypass the deep soil rituals and the environmental impact surveys. You said money could fix the village superstitions. The room grew colder. The secrets were no longer about the past, they were about the very floor they stood upon. It wasn't just rituals you bypassed, Victoria said, her voice growing sharper. She turned to the crowd. Does any of you know how Stanley got his first million? He tells you it was a tech startup. He tells you it was a brilliant investment. Stanley lunged forward. Shut up, Victoria, that's enough. But Chief Olowo moved with surprising speed, blocking Stanley's path. Let the daughter of Amadi speak. The truth is a guest that refuses to be ignored. Victoria pulled a small, yellowed ledger from her purse. It was her father's old farm record book. She flipped to a page marked with a dried hibiscus flower. 10 years ago, my father gave Stanley the savings of our entire village. It was meant to buy a tractor for the community. Stanley took that money to the city, promising to return with the machinery and more. A collective gasp filled the room. Stanley's self-made man persona was evaporating. He never came back, Victoria said, her eyes finally flashing with a spark of suppressed anger. He sent a letter saying the money was lost in a bad deal. But weeks later, we heard of a young man in the city who had started a luxury transport business with 3 brand new cars. The bad deal was our survival, traded for his vanity. The businessmen who had been laughing with Stanley moments ago now looked at him with disgust. In their world, cutthroat tactics were expected, but stealing the survival fund of a starving village was a stain that no amount of success could wash away. I paid it back, Stanley roared, his face purple. I sent a check to the village council last year, 100 times what I took. You sent a check to a council you knew was corrupt, Stanley, Victoria countered. You sent it to men who would pocket it, not to the widows whose sons died because they couldn't afford medicine that year. You didn't pay a debt, you bought a silence. Elena, the investor who had earlier threatened to pull out, stepped into the light. Stanley, is this true? Was your seed capital stolen from a community trust? Stanley opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around for an ally, but even his closest associates were stepping back, literally creating a circle of isolation around him. He was the center of the party, yet he had never been more alone. Victoria held up the ledger. The debt isn't just money, Stanley. It's the breath of the elders who believed in you. It's the sweat of the women who skipped meals to contribute to that fund. You didn't just build a career, you built a prison of gold. And Victoria remembered the words of the village seer before she left. Take the wooden box, Victoria. It contains the only thing a man of shadow cannot face. She reached for the small, wrapped box she had left on a side table. The guests crowded around, curious and fearful. Stanley watched as if the box contained a bomb. In his mind, it probably did. She unwrapped the plain brown cloth, revealing a box made of dark, ancient Iroko wood. You once told me, Stanley, that the village was a place where dreams go to die. You told me that staying there was a sign of weakness. She opened the lid. There was no gold inside. There were no diamonds. Inside the box was a handful of red village earth and a single rusted key. The silence that followed was heavy. Stanley stared at the key. His eyes widened and he began to tremble. He knew that key. It was the key to his father's old toolbox, the one he had thrown into the river the day he left, symbolizing his rejection of his poor heritage. How do you have that? He whispered, his voice barely audible. The river does not keep what it does not belong to, Victoria said. It was washed up after the last great flood. The village children found it and brought it to me. They thought it was a treasure. And it is. It's the key to who you were before you decided to become a lie. Stanley's mother walked over and looked into the box. She picked up a pinch of the red earth and rubbed it between her fingers. She looked at her son, her eyes brimming with tears. Your father worked 30 years with the tools that key opened, she said. He died with those tools in his hands so you could go to school. You threw the key away because you were ashamed of his sweat. But Stanley, sweat is the only thing that washes away the smell of unearned riches. Stanley looked at the earth, then at the diamonds on his guests, then at the cracked marble. The grand illusion was over. He realized that Victoria hadn't come to show him she was rich, she had come to show him he was poor. I wanted to humiliate you, Stanley said, a strange, hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. I invited you here to make you feel like a speck of dust. You succeeded, Stanley, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I am a speck of dust, but remember, dust is what we all return to, and dust is the only thing that can choke a king if he tries to swallow the world. Just then the hotel's security manager rushed into the room looking panicked. He headed straight for Stanley, ignoring the guests. Sir, we have a problem. The city inspectors are outside. They say there's an anonymous report about the land deed and the foundation safety. They're shutting down the building immediately. The word shutting down acted like a cold wind blowing through a field of dry leaves. In an instant, the glamour of the night evaporated. Stanley's friends, the governors, the socialites, the partners, didn't offer words of support. Instead, they began to look for their coats. I can't be seen here if there's a legal scandal. one oil mogul muttered to his wife, pulling her toward the exit. Elena, the shrewd investor, paused only long enough to hand Stanley her business card, or rather, to take back the one she had given him earlier. "Don't bother calling my office, Stanley. My lawyers will be in touch to discuss the recovery of my initial deposit." Stanley watched in a daze as the sea of white and gold drained out of the ballroom. He was like a captain on a sinking ship, watching the lifeboats depart with everyone he had tried so hard to impress. The very people he had bragged to about Victoria's poverty were now stepping over his pride to save their own reputations. Victoria stood still, a pillar of calm amidst the chaos. She didn't gloat. She simply watched the hollow shell of Stanley's life collapse under its own weight. The lead inspector, a stern man named Mr. Okoro, walked into the center of the room. He wasn't swayed by the chandeliers or the expensive wine. He held a tablet and a thick folder of physical documents. "Mr. Stanley," Okoro said, his voice echoing in the now half-empty hall, "we received a tip-off regarding the Amadi Trust. It appears this hotel was built on a right of occupancy that expired 3 years ago and was never legally renewed because the rightful heir had not signed off." Stanley pointed a shaking finger at Victoria. "She did this, she brought those papers to ruin me." Victoria shook her head slowly. "I didn't call them, Stanley. When you build a house on a lie, the lie eventually grows too big for the walls to hold. The city noticed the cracks in your foundation months ago. They were only waiting for the final proof of ownership." Mr. Okoro looked at Victoria, then at the jasper stone around her neck. He tilted his head in respect. "You must be Victoria Amadi. Your father was a man of great honor. He refused to sell this land because he said the ancestors told him a man with a hollow heart would try to pave over the soul of the people." Stanley slumped into one of the velvet chairs, his expensive suit now wrinkled and stained with sweat. The birthday boy looked like an old man. "I worked so hard," he moaned. "I did it all so I'd never be hungry again, so I'd never have to feel the village dust between my toes." "But Stanley," his mother said, sitting on the edge of the table beside him, "you didn't just leave the hunger. You left the love. You left the woman who would have walked through fire for you when you were a nobody." He looked up at Victoria. For the first time that night he really saw her, not as a target for his cruelty, but as the person she had always been, the girl who used to sing to him under the palm trees when the world felt too big and scary. "I hated you," Stanley confessed, his voice breaking. "I hated you because every time I looked at my gold, I remembered that you knew I started with stolen money. I thought if I could humiliate you, I could kill the memory of who I really am." Victoria stepped closer, the silver threads of her dress shimmering like moonlight. "You cannot kill the truth, Stanley. You can only bury it, and things buried in the earth eventually feed the trees that shade your enemies." The room was almost empty now. Only the staff, the inspectors, and a few lingering, curious onlookers remained. The silence Stanley had desired when Victoria walked in had returned, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence. Chief Olowo stepped forward, looking from the broken Stanley to the poised Victoria. "The law is the law," the chief said. "The hotel is built. The damage to the land is done, but the ownership is contested. Victoria, as the heir, you have the power to seize this entire property." Stanley let out a strangled sob. Everything, the cars, the penthouse, the status, hung on Victoria's next words. He expected her to take it, it was what he would have done. It was the smart business move. Victoria looked around the room, at the crystal and the marble, then down at the small box of red earth. "I don't want this building," she said. Stanley's head snapped up. "I don't want a palace built on the tears of my village," Victoria continued. "But I will not let it stand as a monument to greed." Victoria turned to Mr. Okoro and Chief Olowo. "I will sign the papers to regularize the land, but on one condition. This hotel will no longer be the Stanley Plaza. Half of the profits will be diverted into a trust for the Umudike village to build the clinic and the schools the tractor fund was supposed to provide." Stanley gasped. She was saving him from total ruin, but she was stripping him of his absolute power. "And Stanley," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a low, stern tone, "you will remain as the manager, but you will not be the owner. You will work for the people you robbed. You will see their names on the ledgers every day. You will earn your bread with the same honesty your father used with his tools." Stanley looked at the rusted key in the box. He looked at Victoria's indigo dress. He realized that she wasn't just his ex-girlfriend, she was his judge, his jury, and strangely, his only hope for a soul. "Why," Stanley whispered, "why not just destroy me?" Victoria smiled, a sad, beautiful expression. If you pull a thorn from your foot and use it to stab another, you are still carrying the pain of the thorn. I am done with the pain, Stanley, are you? The sun rose over the city, but its light felt different to Stanley. It didn't feel like the spotlight of a stage, it felt like a spotlight in an interrogation room. By 6:00 a.m. the hotel was no longer his kingdom. It was a crime scene of the soul. Most of the staff had quit overnight, fearing they wouldn't be paid. Stanley sat in the middle of the empty ballroom, surrounded by half-eaten appetizers and flat champagne. The man of gold was now a man of shadows. He looked at his reflection in a polished silver tray and saw a stranger, a man who had spent 10 years running away from a village that had now caught up to him. Victoria was gone. She hadn't stayed for the breakfast buffet or the apologies. She had disappeared back to the village as quietly as she had arrived, leaving behind only the scent of jasmine and the weight of her conditions. She saved you, his mother said, appearing from the kitchens with a broom. She had already started cleaning. She didn't look at him with the pride of a billionaire's mother anymore. She looked at him with the stern love of a woman raising a boy. She gave you a path back to being a man. Don't you dare stumble now. A week later, Stanley did something the city never expected. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't hire a PR firm to spin the story. He packed a single bag, not with his designer suits but with sturdy clothes he hadn't worn in years. He drove his luxury car to the edge of the paved road that led to Humiliate. There, he stopped. He looked at the red dust of the village path. He realized that if he drove that car into the village, he was still the same man who wanted to be looked at. He stepped out, left the keys in the ignition with a note saying, "For the village trust," and began to walk. The sun was hot and the dust soon coated his expensive shoes. Every step was a memory. Here was the tree where he first kissed Victoria. There was the stream where he had promised his father he would be a great man. By the time he reached the village square, he was sweating, tired and humbled. He didn't look like a mogul. He looked like a son returning from a long, unsuccessful war. The village elders were gathered under the great oha tree. In the center sat Victoria, wearing her everyday cotton wrapper, her hands stained with the purple juice of the berries she was prepping for market. The village went silent as Stanley approached. No one cheered, no one bowed. They saw the man who had stolen their hope and returned it only when he was caught. "I have come to sign the papers," Stanley said, his voice raspy from the walk. He pulled out the legal documents that transferred 50% of his company's dividends to the Humiliate Development Fund. Victoria stood up. She walked over to him, her eyes searching his. She didn't look for his wealth, she looked for the boy who used to share his lunch. "The papers are just ink and dead trees, Stanley," she said. "The village doesn't want your money as a gift, we want it as a restoration." She pointed to the old, dilapidated schoolhouse. "You will not just sign the check. You will stay here for 1 month. You will help lay the first bricks of the new clinic. You will feel the weight of the work you tried to buy your way out of." The month that followed was the hardest of Stanley's life. His hands, once soft from typing on laptops and gripping steering wheels, blistered and bled. He mixed cement under the scorching sun. He hauled water from the stream. At first the villagers mocked him. "Look at the king playing in the mud," they would say, but Stanley didn't fight back. He worked in silence. He listened to the stories of the widows. He heard about the children who had dropped out of school when the tractor fund vanished. Slowly the blisters turned into calluses. The shame turned into a quiet, steady strength. He wasn't the man of gold anymore, he was becoming a man of the earth. One evening, after a long day of work, Victoria brought him a bowl of pounded yam. They sat in the silence of the twilight, the same silence that had once terrified him at the party. Now it was peaceful. "I'm sorry," Stanley said. It was the first time he had said it without a but or an excuse. "I know," Victoria replied. "The earth knows too, it's starting to hold your weight again." Stanley did not become the richest man in the world again. He became something much rarer, an honest man. The hotel in the city flourished, but its name was changed to the Ahmadi Heritage. It became a place where the village's crafts were sold and where the history of the land was honored. Stanley stayed as the manager, but every year he returned to the village to work in the fields for 1 month, to remind his feet where they belonged. Victoria never married Stanley. Some stories say she found a love that had never been broken, others say she became the wisest elder the village had ever seen. But they remained bound by the land and the lesson they learned that night at the party. Remember, never invite someone to your table just to show them how hungry they are. for you never know if they are the ones who carry the key to the very house you sit in.